The August heat in New Orleans did not merely exist. It pressed down upon the city like a heavy, wet palm. It was a suffocating, tangible thing that rose from the cracked asphalt of the French Quarter and hung thick in the air, smelling of sweet rot, blooming jasmine, and the ancient, muddy breath of the Mississippi River. But inside the Sterling Institute for Neurological Research, the seasons did not exist. The air here was scrubbed clean, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, and smelled of antiseptic and ambitious silence. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, towering over the humid city, a place where miracles were performed by men who believed themselves to be gods. Virginia worked in the basement. At 28, she was not a doctor, nor a nurse, nor even a researcher. She was a medical illustrator, a translator of the flesh. While the surgeons upstairs dealt in blood and bone, Virginia dealt in graphite and ink. She sat at a drafting table, surrounded by the hum of the building's ventilation system, turning the chaotic reality of the human body into clean, understandable lines for textbooks and surgical journals. She was invisible here. She was the woman with the charcoal-stained fingers who rode the service elevator. She was the shadow who came in early to sketch cadavers in the morgue and left late, walking home through the sticky heat to a studio apartment that cost more than she could afford. She wore oversized cardigans to hide her frame, preferring to observe the world rather than participate in it. She knew the anatomy of a heart better than anyone in the building, yet she had convinced herself that her own was destined to remain a theoretical concept, drawn, studied, but never truly held. We memorize the facts to keep the world orderly, never realizing that the only truths worth keeping are the ones that defy explanation. The phone on her desk buzzed, a harsh intrusion in the quiet sanctuary of the archives. "The director requests your presence," a sharp voice said. "Top floor. Immediate consult." Virginia stared at the phone. The director, Desmond Sterling. He was the Institute's crown jewel, a neurosurgeon of such terrifying brilliance that rumors followed him like a wake. They said he could remove a tumor from a memory center without the patient losing a single day of their past. They also said he was cold, a man who had excised his own emotions to make room for more intellect. He was famous for walking past residents he had worked with for years without recognizing them. To Desmond Sterling, people were puzzles to be solved, not stories to be read. Virginia gathered her sketchbook and her charcoal pencils. Her hands trembled slightly. She smoothed her skirt, took a breath that tasted of recycled air, and stepped into the elevator. The ascent to the 40th floor felt like traveling to a different planet. The doors opened onto a lobby of white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the sprawling, humid city below into a distant abstraction. Desmond was standing by the window, his back to the room. He was taller than she expected. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with military precision, his white coat discarded on a leather chair. His posture was rigid, a line of tension drawn tight against the horizon. "You are the illustrator," he said. He didn't turn around. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, devoid of warmth but rich with authority. "Virginia," she corrected softly, stepping into the room. "My name is Virginia." He turned then. Desmond Sterling was devastatingly handsome, but in the way a glacier is handsome, sharp, bright, and dangerous to touch. He had eyes the color of slate, intelligent and unyielding, framed by dark lashes that seemed too soft for such a hard face. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. His gaze swept over her face like a scanner, registering the data but ignoring the soul. "I have a patient," Desmond said, walking past her to a massive light board covered in MRI scans. He didn't acknowledge her name. To him, she was a tool, a function. Glioblastoma. It's wrapped around the Broca's area. The imaging is insufficient. The depth perception is flattened by the scan. I need to see the spatial relationship between the tumor and the speech center before I cut. He pointed to the gray blur on the screen. "Draw it," he commanded. Give me the third dimension. Virginia stepped up to the light board. She opened her sketchbook. She looked at the scan, her eyes narrowing. She didn't just see a tumor, she saw the invasion. She saw the cruelty of a growth silencing a person's voice. She picked up her charcoal. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the scratch of graphite on paper and the low hum of the air conditioning. Desmond stood beside her, watching. Virginia forgot where she was. She forgot the famous surgeon. She fell into the trance of creation. She didn't just copy the scan, she interpreted it. She drew the delicate, spiderweb filaments of the nerves. She shaded the heavy, suffocating weight of a tumor. She drew the tension of a tissue, the fragility of the life held in the balance. She finished and stepped back, her fingers smudged with black dust. Desmond stepped forward. He looked at the drawing. He stared at it for a long time. The silence stretched, becoming thin and taut. He reached out, his long, surgeon's finger hovering over the paper, tracing the line she had drawn near the optic nerve. "You drew the pressure," he whispered. It wasn't a compliment, it was a realization. He looked up from the paper, and for the first time, his slate-gray eyes locked onto hers. He didn't look through her. He stopped at her. He saw the smudge of charcoal on her cheekbone. He saw the quiet intelligence in her brown eyes. He saw the woman who had just shown him the invisible enemy he was about to fight. "The scan didn't show the pressure," Desmond said, his voice losing a fraction of its professional distance. "How did you know?" "Because," Virginia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the body always flinches before the blow, doctor. Even on the inside." Desmond looked at her, really looked at her, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the ice in his expression cracked. He looked like a man who had forgotten the language of human connection, only to hear a familiar word spoken in a foreign land. The impact was silent, invisible, and absolute. September brought the storms. They rolled in off the Gulf of Mexico, turning the sky over New Orleans into a bruised tapestry of purple and charcoal. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the Sterling Institute, blurring the city lights into weeping streaks of neon. For 3 weeks, the service elevator had become Virginia's portal between two worlds. By day, she cataloged bones in the silent, fluorescent basement. By night, she was summoned to the clouds. The summons were always the same: a buzzing phone, a terse command, and the ride up 40 floors to the office that felt like the inside of a glacier. Desmond Sterling had developed a dependency. It wasn't spoken, but it was palpable. He no longer operated on difficult cases without first seeing them rendered in Virginia's charcoal. He needed to see the pressure, the flinch, the invisible emotional weight of the anatomy that his MRI machines couldn't capture. Tonight, the office was lit only by the lightning flashing outside and the clinical glow of the lightboard. Virginia stood at the drafting table Desmond had ordered moved into the corner of his sanctuary. It was a beautiful table, mahogany and brass, looking wildly out of place amidst his chrome and leather furniture. It was the first time he had allowed something warm into his space. She was sketching the intricate web of a pediatric patient's nervous system. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic scratch-scratch of her pencil and the distant rumble of thunder. Desmond was at his desk, reviewing files, but he wasn't reading. He was watching her. Virginia could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. It was a physical sensation, heavier than the humidity outside. She paused, blowing a layer of graphite dust off the paper. "You are staring, doctor," she said softly, not turning around. "I am observing," Desmond corrected, his voice cutting through the dim light. "There is a difference." He stood up and walked over to her. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned every inch of the floor he walked on. He stopped beside the table, close enough that she could smell the crisp, sterile scent of his soap, mixed with the faint, underlying aroma of espresso. He looked down at the drawing. Then he looked at her hands. They were stained gray up to the wrists, the evidence of her labor marking her skin. "Dr. Arrington came in today," Desmond said suddenly. "The chief of oncology. He has worked on this floor for 12 years. Virginia looked up, confused by the non sequitur. "I know Dr. Arrington. He has a kind face. I walked past him in the corridor," Desmond admitted, his expression flat, unreadable. "He said hello. I nodded, but I had absolutely no idea who he was. His name, it was just a blank space in the file cabinet." He leaned in closer, his slate eyes darkening with a rare admission of vulnerability. "I have memorized the entire neural network of the human brain, Virginia. I can recite the path of the vagus nerve in my sleep. But people, they slide off me like water on glass. They are clutter. Is that why you don't have photos in your office?" Virginia asked, gesturing to the barren shelves. "Because you don't want to remember who belongs in the frames." "Memory is a liability," Desmond whispered. "It implies attachment. Attachment affects the steadiness of the hand." He reached out. For a moment, Virginia thought he was going to take the pencil from her. Instead, his cool fingers brushed the side of her hand, right where a smudge of charcoal had darkened her skin. The contact was electric. It was a micro-event, a shifting of tectonic plates. Virginia stopped breathing. Desmond didn't pull away. He traced the line of a vein on the back of her hand, his touch clinical yet terrifyingly intimate. "And yet," Desmond murmured, his voice dropping to a rough timbre, "I find that I remember the exact shade of brown in your eyes. I remember that you take your coffee with 2 sugars, even though I disapprove of sugar. And I remember your name. We build fortresses of ice to keep the world at a distance, terrified that if we let someone close enough to melt the walls, we will drown in the flood." The air in the room grew thin. The storm outside hammered against the glass, matching the chaotic rhythm of Virginia's heart. He wasn't supposed to remember those things. He was the god on the 40th floor. She was the ghost in the basement. "Desmond," she breathed, using his first name for the first time. It felt like a transgression. He looked at her mouth as she said it. His gaze dropped to her lips, hungry and confused, as if he were trying to diagnose an illness he had never encountered before. He leaned in, the centimeters between them vanishing. The phone on his desk rang. It was a shrill, violent sound that shattered the moment into 1,000 pieces. Desmond flinched. The mask slammed back into place instantly. He pulled his hand away, his back straightening, the cold surgeon returning in the blink of an eye. He walked to the desk and picked up the receiver. "Sterling," he answered, his voice devoid of the warmth that had been there seconds ago. Virginia watched him, feeling cold without his proximity. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw him nod. "Yes," Desmond said into the phone. "I haven't forgotten." "The engagement dinner." "Yes. Vanessa's waiting. Tell her I am coming down." "Vanessa." The name hung in the air like smoke. Desmond hung up the phone. He didn't look at Virginia immediately. He stood with his back to her, adjusting his cufflinks, rebuttoning his suit jacket. He was putting the armor back on. "I have to go," he said to the window. "Leave the drawing on the desk when you are finished. Take the service elevator." He turned around. His face was a fortress once more. He looked at her, and for a second, she saw a flicker of regret, a crack in the ice. But he sealed it shut. "Good night, miss," he started, then stopped. He caught himself. He had almost reverted to his default setting, almost forgotten her to save himself. "Virginia," he finished softly, the name sounding like a surrender. He walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving Virginia alone in the glass tower with her charcoal stains and the crushing realization that while he might remember her name, he belonged to a world that would never let him remember her heart. The Sterling Institute annual gala was a spectacle of white orchids and cold ambition. The atrium, usually a cavern of echoing footsteps, had been transformed into a ballroom of glass, suspended high above the city lights of New Orleans. It was a gathering of the gods of medicine, Men and women who held life and death in their sanitized hands, sipping vintage champagne and discussing mortality rates as if they were stock prices. Virginia stood near the service entrance, hidden behind a towering arrangement of lilies. She wasn't on the guest list. She had been summoned by the public relations director to deliver the framed prints of her anatomical sketches, gifts for the high-tier donors. She wore her best dress, a navy blue sheath that she had bought at a thrift store, but against the sea of couture silk and diamonds, she felt like a rough draft in a room full of masterpieces. She held her breath, scanning the crowd, telling herself she wasn't looking for him. But the heart has a memory that logic cannot erase. She found him. Desmond stood near the podium. He was dressed in a tuxedo that made him look like a sleek, dangerous weapon. He was the center of gravity in the room, the sun around which the donors orbited. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, her arm looped through his with the possessive ease of a vine choking a tree, was Vanessa. She was radiant, blonde, and impeccably polished, the daughter of a pharmaceutical tycoon. She was the perfect match for the Sterling legacy, strategic, wealthy, and visible. Virginia watched as Desmond leaned down to hear something Vanessa whispered. He didn't smile, but he didn't pull away. He looked resigned, like a man accepting a diagnosis he couldn't cure. We memorize the facts to keep the world orderly, never realizing that the only truths worth keeping are the ones that defy explanation. He looks like a king, doesn't he? The voice was dry, brittle. Virginia turned. An older man stood beside her. He had Desmond's eyes, but they were colder, harder, eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. It was Dr. Arthur Sterling, Desmond's father and the chairman of the board. "Sir," Virginia murmured, stepping back. "You're the illustrator," Arthur said, glancing at her hands, which were clean tonight but still bore the faint, permanent shadow of graphite under the nails. "Desmond told me about your assistance. He finds your drawings useful for the layman." Useful! The word felt clinical, sterile. "Desmond is a man of great utility," Arthur continued, taking a sip of his drink. He looked at his son across the room. "He understands that marriage, like surgery, is not about passion. It is about precision. Vanessa brings the pharmaceutical funding. Desmond brings the prestige. It is a perfect suture." Virginia felt a cold nausea rise in her throat. "He is a person, Dr. Sterling, not a procedure." Arthur chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "In this family, my dear, we are all procedures. Desmond knows his duty. He knows that to save the Institute, he must sacrifice the self. He forgets nothing, including his place." Across the room, the music swelled. The crowd parted. Desmond was moving toward the microphone. He looked up. His gaze swept the room, the donors, the press, the expectant faces. And then, inevitably, it landed on the service entrance. He saw her. Virginia froze. For a heartbeat, the gala dissolved. Desmond looked at her with an intensity that burned. She saw the conflict in his face, the crack in the ice. She saw the man who had touched her hand in the dark office, the man who remembered her coffee order. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to acknowledge her. But Vanessa squeezed his arm. She whispered something, pointing to the cameras. Desmond blinked. The mask slammed back down. The warmth vanished, replaced by the terrifying, blank slate of the surgeon preparing to cut. He looked away from Virginia as if she were a smudge on the lens, a flaw to be edited out. "Ladies and gentlemen," Desmond said into the microphone, his voice smooth, commanding, and utterly hollow. "Tonight is about legacy. It is about ensuring that the Sterling name continues to lead the world in preservation." He paused. He looked at Vanessa. "And it is my honor to announce the union that will secure that future." The room erupted in applause. Virginia felt the sound like a physical blow. He had done it. He had chosen the funding. He had chosen the memory of his name over the reality of his heart. She turned to leave. desperate to escape the suffocation of the room. Leaving so soon? Desmond was there. He had stepped off the stage, moving through the crowd with a speed that belied his calm demeanor. He stood in front of her, blocking her path to the service elevator. He was close, too close. She could smell the champagne on his breath, mixed with the cold, sterile scent of his betrayal. "You announced it," Virginia whispered, clutching her purse. "You chose the suture." "I secured the funding," Desmond corrected, his voice low, urgent. "The Institute was failing, Virginia. The research, the memory trials, they were going to be defunded." "I had to." "You had to erase yourself?" she asked, tears pricking her eyes. "You told me you remembered my name, Desmond. But tonight, you looked at me and you didn't see a person. You saw a liability." "That's not true," he insisted, reaching for her arm. "Isn't it?" Vanessa appeared at his side, her smile bright and razor-sharp. "Desmond, darling, the photographers are waiting." "Who is this?" She looked at Virginia. She looked at the cheap dress, the sensible shoes. Desmond looked at Virginia. He looked at the woman who had drawn his soul on a piece of paper. He knew that if he claimed her now, if he introduced her as anything other than staff, the scandal would rock the foundation of the merger. He would lose the funding. He would lose the Institute. He had to make the incision. He had to cut the tissue to save the organ. "She is." Desmond hesitated. His throat worked. He looked into Virginia's eyes, pleading for forgiveness he hadn't earned. "She is the illustrator. She works in the basement." The basement. He put her back in the dark. He put her back in the ground. "Ah," Vanessa said, dismissing Virginia with a wave of her hand. "The help? Well, run along. We don't need sketches tonight." Virginia looked at Desmond. She saw the devastation in his eyes, buried deep beneath the layers of duty and fear. But it didn't matter. He had spoken. He had named her place. "You're right, doctor," Virginia said, her voice trembling but clear. "I draw anatomy. I draw the heart. But I can't draw something that isn't there." She stepped back. She didn't run this time. She walked away with the slow, deliberate pace of a mourner leaving a gravesite. Desmond stood frozen. He watched her walk into the shadows of the service corridor. He wanted to scream. He wanted to chase her. But his feet were nailed to the floor by the weight of a Sterling legacy. He had saved the Institute. He had secured the future. But as he watched the elevator doors close on Virginia's face, he realized he had just lobotomized his own life. The separation was absolute, clinical, and fatal. The weeks following the gala were not marked by celebration at the Sterling Institute. They were marked by a silence so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The funding had been secured. The merger was moving forward. The headlines praised Desmond Sterling as the visionary who had saved the future of neurological research. But in the basement, Virginia was packing. It was late on a Thursday evening. The air conditioning hummed its monotonous, artificial tune. Virginia emptied her desk drawers, placing her charcoal pencils, her erasers, and her personal sketchbooks into a cardboard box. She moved with the efficient, detached numbness of a woman who had performed her own autopsy and found nothing left to save. She had submitted her resignation that morning. Not to Desmond. She couldn't bear to look at him. She had slipped the envelope under the door of HR, effectively erasing herself from the building, just as he had erased her from the room. She picked up the final drawing, the one of the glioblastoma, the one where she had drawn the pressure. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the dark shading. "You're leaving!" The voice came from the shadows near the service elevator. It wasn't the commanding baritone of the director. It was rough, frayed, stripped of its polish. Virginia turned. Desmond stood there. He was still wearing his scrubs, but they looked wrinkled, lived in. His white coat was unbuttoned. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the night of the gala. The fluorescent lights of the basement were harsh, exposing the dark circles under his eyes and the tremor in his hands, the hands that were insured for millions. "I gave my notice," Virginia said, placing the drawing into the box. She didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to let him see the fresh pain in her eyes. "My work here is done. The donors have their prints. The textbooks are illustrated." "You didn't resign," Desmond said, walking into the light. "You fled." "I survived," Virginia corrected, snapping the lid of the box shut. "There is a difference, doctor. You taught me that. Sometimes you have to cut out the affected tissue to save the organism." "Is that what I am?" Desmond asked, stepping closer. "Affected tissue? You are the surgeon who forgot that the patient was awake," Virginia whispered, finally looking at him. "You stood on that stage, Desmond. You looked me in the eye, and you called me the illustrator. You reduced me to a function because it was convenient." "It wasn't convenient," Desmond snapped, the anger flashing in his eyes. Not at her, but at himself. "It was necessary. Do you think I wanted to do that? Do you think I enjoyed watching you walk away?" "I think you enjoyed the applause," Virginia countered. "I think you enjoyed the safety of the Sterling name more than the risk of being human." Desmond let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He ran a hand through his hair, destroying the perfect coif. He paced the small space between the drafting tables, a caged animal finally realizing the bars were of his own making. "Safety!" He spat the word out. "You think I'm safe? Virginia, I haven't operated in 3 days." The confession hung in the air, shocking and absolute. Virginia froze. "What?" "I canceled my surgeries," Desmond admitted, stopping in front of her. "The board is furious. Vanessa is frantic. But I can't do it. I look at the scans, and all I see is gray static. I look at the patients, and I can't see the pressure anymore. I can't see the life." He looked at her, his defenses crumbling. "You took the site with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't a medical chart. It was her resignation letter. He hadn't sent it to HR. He had intercepted it. "My father told me that memory is a liability," Desmond said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He taught me that to be a great surgeon, I had to be a blank slate. No attachments. No names. Just anatomy." He crumpled the resignation letter in his fist. "But he lied. I tried to forget you, Virginia. I tried to edit you out of the frame like a bad artifact in an MRI. But you are not an artifact. You are the structural integrity of the entire building. We build fortresses of ice to keep the world at a distance, terrified that if we let someone close enough to melt the walls, we will drown in the flood." "Why are you here, Desmond?" Virginia asked, her voice trembling. "If you are marrying Vanessa, if you are saving the Institute, why are you in the basement?" "Because the Institute is a morgue without you," Desmond said. "And because I broke the engagement." The silence that followed was deafening. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to vanish. Virginia stared at him, unable to process the words. "You what?" "I ended it an hour ago," Desmond said. He sounded exhausted, but lighter, as if he had just excised a tumor from his own brain. "I told Vanessa. I told my father. I told them that the funding isn't worth the cost of my eyesight. I told them I couldn't marry a woman whose name I have to remind myself to remember, when there is a woman in the basement whose name is burned into my chest." He took a step toward her. He didn't touch her yet. He looked at the box in her arms. "You can leave," Desmond said softly. "You have every right to walk out that door and never look back. I hurt you. I humiliated you. I don't deserve a second chance." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a vulnerability that was terrifying to witness. "But if you leave, Virginia, take the charcoal. Because I can't draw the map back to myself without you." Virginia looked at the man standing in the harsh fluorescent light. She saw the ruins of his perfect life crashing down around him. He had blown up his world. The money, the prestige, the safety, just to come down 40 floors and tell her the truth. She felt the weight of the box in her arms. It contained her tools, her safety, her escape plan. Slowly, she set the box down on the drafting table. "You broke the engagement," she whispered, needing to hear it again. "I severed the limb," Desmond nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It hurts like hell, but the patient is going to live." He reached out his hand. It was shaking, just slightly. "I don't know who I am without the Sterling legacy," Desmond admitted. "I don't know if they'll let me keep my license after this. But I know that I am tired of the cold." Virginia looked at his hand. It was the hand of a surgeon, capable of miracles, now reaching out for the only thing he couldn't fix on his own. She realized that the forbidden love wasn't forbidden because of his class or his wealth. It was forbidden because he had outlawed his own heart. And tonight, he had finally legalized it. She reached out. Her fingers, still faintly stained with graphite, brushed against his palm. "It's going to be messy, Desmond," she warned softly. "I know," he breathed, his fingers closing around hers, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "But I think I'm finally ready to get my hands dirty." The basement of the Sterling Institute was designed to be soundproof, a vault for the dead and the data. But as Desmond's hand closed over Virginia's, the silence didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a canvas, blank, terrifying, and waiting to be filled. Desmond didn't let go of her hand. He looked down at the box of charcoal pencils she had packed, then at his own unbuttoned white coat, the symbol of his authority, his armor, his identity for 35 years. Slowly, deliberately, he shrugged the coat off his shoulders. It fell onto the drafting table, a heap of white fabric that looked like a ghost collapsing. He didn't look at it. He was done being a ghost. "Come," he said, his voice rough but steady. They walked to the service elevator. Desmond Sterling, the director, the heir, the god of the 40th floor, did not take the private glass lift that overlooked the city. He stood beside the illustrator in the scarred metal box that smelled of industrial cleaner. He watched the numbers climb, not to the penthouse, but to the lobby, ground zero. When the doors opened, the atrium was empty, save for the night security and the cleaning crew buffing the marble floors. The air was still cold, still Sterling perfect. They walked across the lobby. The security guard, a man Desmond had passed every day for 10 years without a glance, looked up in surprise. "Good evening, Dr. Sterling," the guard stammered, eyeing Virginia and the lack of a coat. Desmond stopped. He looked at the guard. He blinked, the old software in his brain trying to categorize the man as furniture, but the new operating system, the one Virginia had rebooted, forcing him to see a human being. "Good evening," Desmond said. He paused, glancing at the ID badge on the man's chest. "Frank." The guard's jaw dropped. Desmond didn't wait for a reaction. He pushed open the heavy glass doors, and they stepped out into the New Orleans night. The impact was physical. The humidity hit them like a wall, thick, wet, and smelling of ozone and exhaust. The sounds of the city rushed in, a distant siren, the rumble of a streetcar, the laughter of tourists on Canal Street. It was chaotic. It was messy. It was uncontrolled. Desmond took a deep breath, inhaling the imperfect air. He looked at his hands, illuminated by the street lights. They were empty of scalpels, empty of charts. "I have never been outside at this hour without a pager," Desmond admitted, looking at the street as if it were a foreign country. "I don't know the protocol for this." "There is no protocol, Desmond," Virginia said softly, shifting her box of pencils to her hip. "That's the point. You just walk. You just breathe." "I ruined my life tonight," he murmured, though he didn't sound like a man in mourning. He sounded like a man waking up from a coma. "My father will convene the board tomorrow. They will strip my title. Vanessa will ensure the funding is pulled. I will be the most brilliant, unemployed surgeon in the history of the South." "Does it scare you?" Virginia asked. Desmond turned to her. The streetlights cast shadows across his sharp cheekbones, softening the edges of the man who was once made of ice. Terrifyingly, he confessed, but not as much as the alternative. He reached out and touched her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, not checking for lymph nodes, not analyzing bone structure, but simply memorizing the feeling of her skin. I spent my life studying the brain, Virginia. I thought if I could map every neuron, every synapse, I could control the outcome. I thought memory was just data storage. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, two outcasts standing on the sidewalk while the machinery of the Sterling Institute hummed on without them behind the glass. "But I was wrong," he whispered. "We memorize the facts to keep the world orderly, never realizing that the only truths worth keeping are the ones that defy explanation." "You are my truth," he said. "The one variable I couldn't predict and the only outcome I want." Virginia closed her eyes, tears slipping out to mix with the humidity on her cheeks. She had spent years drawing the inside of the human body, trying to make people see the beauty in the biology. But standing here, held by the man who had discarded his kingdom to find her in the dark, she realized that love was the only anatomy that couldn't be drawn. It could only be felt. "I don't have a plan, Desmond," she whispered. "I have a studio apartment with a leaky faucet and a box of charcoal. I have steady hands." Desmond smiled, and it was a real smile, one that reached his slate-gray eyes and cracked the last of the glacier. "And a lot to learn about the messy parts of life. Teach me." He kissed her then. It wasn't the precise, clinical kiss of a society engagement. It was deep, desperate, and unpolished. It tasted of the humid night and the terrifying freedom of falling. It was a kiss that sealed the incision, not to hide the wound, but to let it heal. The next morning, the sun rose over the Mississippi River, burning off the fog. The Sterling Institute opened its doors at 8 a.m. sharp, the air conditioning humming, the surgeon scrubbing in, the machine grinding on. But on the 40th floor, the director's office remained empty. The light board was dark. Miles away, in a small cafe in the French Quarter, a man in a wrinkled dress shirt sat across from a woman with charcoal-stained fingers. He was drinking coffee with 2 sugars, a habit he used to disapprove of, but now found sweet. He wasn't talking about tumors. He wasn't talking about funding. He was listening. Desmond Sterling had lost his title, his inheritance, and his standing in the medical community. To the world, he was a cautionary tale of a genius who burned out. But as he watched Virginia laugh, sketching his face on a napkin, capturing not the surgeon but the man, he knew he had found something the MRI scans never showed him. He knew that legacy wasn't about having your name on a building. It was about having your name whispered by the person who knew who you were when the lights went out. He took the napkin from her. He looked at the drawing, the messy, human, imperfect sketch of a man in love. He folded it and placed it in his pocket, right over his heart. He might have forgotten 1,000 faces in his lifetime, erased 1,000 names to keep his mind sharp for the blade. But as he took Virginia's hand across the table, Desmond knew that even if his mind one day failed him, even if the neurons misfired and the data corrupted, he would never be lost again. Because he had finally learned that the heart has a memory all its own, and hers was the only name written there in permanent ink.